One approach for dealing with the threats of climate change is through the development of technologies that address the problem both directly and indirectly. Of course, we know that the problems presented by climate change are the direct result of there being too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So it follows that we must stop emitting more carbon and even remove some of it. This idea is central to the world's current plan to avoid catastrophe. There are many suggestions as to how to actually do this. They range from planting a massive amount of trees to using technological solutions that remove carbon dioxide from the air. The global consensus is that by deploying these and other techniques while also reducing the burning of fossil fuels, that somewhere around the middle of this century, we will achieve net zero. We've heard the term used by politicians and mentioned in the media. On the face of it, it seems like a straightforward concept, but it isn't really. You'll also hear a lot of other terms bandied about in any discussion about net zero. Terms like climate neutral, GHG neutral, carbon neutral, and so on. They're terms that are used in an attempt to clarify what net zero means in different contexts, but mostly they lead to a lot more confusion among people who just want to know that practical steps are being taken to get us out of this mess. So what do those terms really mean? Let's start with net zero. Net zero means achieving a balance between the amount of emissions produced and those removed from the atmosphere in order to reduce global warming. Reaching net zero refers to balancing these two sides of the equation. This can be understood by using the metaphor of a sink being filled up with water. To prevent the sink from overflowing, you can either turn off the tap, which would be like reducing emissions, or remove the plug and drain the water, which would be like removing emissions from the atmosphere. Net zero is the equivalent of making sure the amount of water coming from the tap is equal to that being drained through the plug hole. Net zero allows for some emissions to be above zero so long as they are balanced out elsewhere to achieve net zero global carbon emissions. Rather than attempting to reduce the amount of carbon emissions to zero, the net zero emissions target allows some areas to operate with positive rather than negative emissions. This allows for sectors where it would be difficult to reach net zero emissions, such as aviation, to operate while being offset by other sectors where it is easier to reduce emissions or find alternatives for energy consumption. When it comes to solutions, like for like is an important term to understand. Like for like is a term that's used when the activity that causes emissions or warming is closely related to the activity that reduces emissions or warming, including the time scale over which it's done, as well as the durability of the solution. For example, carbon stored in the Earth's crust is pretty stable over timescales like many thousands of years, as long as we don't extract it and burn it. So, to neutralize the effect of emissions that come from something like burning fossil fuels, the solution must also be viable over thousands of years. This would be a like-for-like solution. It can't be a short-term thing. Achieving a balance between carbon dioxide emissions in and carbon dioxide emissions taken out would mean that we have achieved a state where activities are carbon neutral. But carbon neutral doesn't just refer to the entire system as a whole. It also refers to the emissions balance that is achieved by any individual nation, industry, or company. It's not the ultimate end state that we want to achieve, because it only refers to carbon dioxide, and there are no set boundaries as to the time scale needed to achieve it, or even the relative magnitude of the emissions involved. It's not a like-for-like solution. GHG neutral means that any country, industry, or company's contribution to global greenhouse gas emissions is zero. Any GHG emissions they release into the atmosphere are fully balanced by GHG reductions that they themselves accomplish. Again, while this is a good step, it's not the end state we want to have because it has major limitations and is also not a like-for-like solution. Activities that are climate neutral are those that result in no net effect on the climate system. In this case, any GHG emissions or other activities that cause climate warming are fully balanced by activities that reduce GHG emissions or have some other kind of climate cooling effect. This term is almost identical to GHG neutral, but it also includes things like land use changes that alter how the Earth absorbs or reflects heat back into the atmosphere. Like the previous terms, it's a good intermediate step, but it's not a like-for-like solution. Carbon negative refers to activities where the removal of carbon exceeds the emissions of a country, industry, or company, using solutions that are like for like. Now we're getting somewhere, but carbon negative is still just an intermediate step, since it only refers to carbon. When the total GHG removals by a country, industry, or company exceed their emissions, and the solutions used are like for like, the term used to describe this state is climate positive. This is the type of end state we want to achieve. But be careful when using the term climate positive, because another term that is used, and which has an identical meaning, is the term net negative. Climate positive, net negative, there's a lot of room there for confusion. But what state do we want the world to eventually achieve? Well, that would be absolute zero or zero emissions. That's when a country, industry, or company puts out no GHG emissions whatsoever. There's no need to balance or offset with removals of GHGs. There's just no greenhouse gases emitted, period. However, if we can reach absolute zero while continuing to carry out activities that are climate positive, we should be able to reverse the damage we've already done to the climate system. We can get there one day. Admittedly, this all fits into a larger, more complex landscape of communication. Scientific uncertainty, long timescales, and a wide spectrum of impacts that vary based on location mean that climate change presents plenty of communication challenges without the addition of a complex patchwork of terminology that is often misunderstood or misinterpreted. From politicians and industry stakeholders to NGOs and the public, to get to the net zero emission world we seek, the first step is to make sure everyone is on the same page. No matter what perspective we're coming from, communicating better about these issues makes a big impact and brings us closer to achieving the critical climate goals that our environment, economy, and society need.